Today on Miles to Zen, we dive into an extraordinary near-death experience that challenges the very nature of consciousness. This is a story that will shift perspectives, spark curiosity, and leave you questioning your own ideas of what lies beyond. If this conversation resonates with you, subscribe or follow so more people can discover this incredible journey, and be sure to listen until the end. I've included some special moments from our conversation, including how we set the scene and a heartwarming story from one of my guests' books. Welcome to Miles to Zen, where we explore personal growth, mindfulness, and transformation. And today I couldn't be more thrilled to introduce Dr. Eben Alexander, a renowned neurosurgeon, best-selling author, and thought leader whose extraordinary journey has captivated millions. For over 25 years, Dr. Alexander was a respected academic neurosurgeon, including 15 years at Brigham and Women's Hospital, Boston Children's Hospital, and Harvard Medical School. And once firmly rooted in the materialist view that consciousness is purely a product of the brain, his perspective was shaken in 2008 when a rare bacterial meningitis left him in a week-long coma. By medical standards, his brain should have been incapable of thought, yet he experienced a profound journey beyond this world, an experience that defied everything science had taught him. And against all odds, he made an inexplicable recovery. His case was validated in the peer-reviewed Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease. And since then, he has dedicated his life to bridging science and spirituality, redefining our understandings of consciousness, quantum physics, and human potential. He was also recognized in the Watkins Mind, Body, Spirit list of the most 100 spiritually influential living people, alongside the Dalai Lama, Eckhart Tolle, Oprah Winfrey, and the late Pope Francis, and his work continues to inspire millions. You may have seen him already in over 400 interviews, including Good Morning America, Oprah's Super Soul Sunday, Larry King, Discovery Channel, countless podcasts. He's even presented alongside the Dalai Lama, who had invited him to present, and now he's here on Miles to Zen. I first discovered the Map of Heaven in my parents' library, and later devoured The Proof of Heaven and Living in a Mindful Universe, which led me to a huge aha moment of my own and feelings of synchronicity throughout these two books, and many goosebumps along the way, which I call truth bumps. So I couldn't be more excited to welcome Dr. Eben Alexander to the show. Get ready, this conversation promises to be paradigm shifting and deeply inspiring. Dr. Alexander, welcome.
Well, Shannon, so great to be with you today, and I appreciate your invitation and look forward to our little chat.
Me too. So I thought that how we could start is maybe you could share a little bit about your near-death experience. And for people that don't know, it's just such a wonderful story to share that even though I've been very familiar with near-death experience stories, I used to gobble those up as a kid, they never get old. And yours in particular is so interesting, especially when you take into account the beginnings of your life. And I'm not going to do any spoilers because I really think everyone should read this Proof of Heaven first, and then The Mindful Universe second.
Yeah, Living in a Mindful Universe. It's that's where we really try and bring the science and spirituality together. But at any rate, yeah, I can start and give kind of a brief overview of my NDE because people want a lot of details. There are many details out there. If you search on the internet for Eben Alexander, you'll find many renderings of this. But the important things to stress for our conversation, especially because I do want to lead into that third book, which is where a lot of the important stuff is. I'd spent the first 54 years of my life honing a very kind of conventional scientific worldview. And that was largely under the influence of my father, my adoptive father. Important to point out that I was adopted. That's a giant part of my history and the story. And to make any sense of it, you've got to know that that adoption abandonment wound was there and that this was very healing in that sense. So by conventional scientific worldview, what I mean is physicalism or materialism, the notion that only the physical or material world exists, and therefore we must somehow muster consciousness to emerge out of the physical workings of the brain. Now, admittedly, nobody in neuroscience from a materialist standpoint has ever put forward the very first thought about how consciousness might be related to the brain. In fact, what materialists often try and do is just pretend consciousness doesn't even exist. That's the easiest
Yeah.
way to get rid of that little problem.
Oh, you bring up these examples in your book of these conversations, and it's like I can watch the people, they either skirt around it or they just can't hear it.
Right. Well, that's, and it's part of the problem with materialist science, certainly in the 20th and early 21st century, was that often, scientists would get out there and claim, oh, well, NDEs make no sense. They can't be true because they violate everything we know about the brain and mind and consciousness. Well, no, they don't at all, not even a little bit. In fact, the thinking that somehow you could trace, cognitive processing, thoughts, emotions, and all that to the chemical reactions and electron fluxes in the brain, now that's a wild story that really doesn't have a basis in fact. And that's why it's so important for the world at large to realize the scientific community has moved beyond that. So getting now to my little personal discovery of that for myself, and that came in the form of this spontaneous case of severe gram-negative bacterial meningoencephalitis that hit me in the middle of the night, early morning of November 10th, 2008, when I woke up with horrific back pain, soon a bad headache, grand mal seizures, and lapsed into coma at home in my bed. Now, there's a false story out there perpetrated by a writer. He's not a journalist, but he was trying to discredit me. And we claimed that it was a medication-induced coma. Well, he couldn't have been further from the truth. And the reason the scientific community takes my story so seriously is I went deep into coma without any sedation at all. And when I came out of coma, I was under heavy sedation. So you can throw out the medically induced coma part because it's not relevant to any of this. But the reason it's important is because the way meningitis wrecks your conscious awareness is by destroying the main human calculator, the neocortex, the outer surface of the brain. That's the part that makes us human. And meningitis very specifically attacks that entire human part of the brain. All the details of everything we've ever seen, heard, smelled, memories of past events, executive function, prediction of future events, all this kind of interaction of the brain involves the neocortex. And when that whole neocortex is offline, you cannot have a dream or hallucination or any kind of a memory of anything, because all that stuff, according to modern neuroscience, demands certain parts of the neocortex be working. And that's why when I woke up from coma, initially trying to tell my doctors about this extraordinary spiritual experience, and they would just pat me on the back and say, well, your brain was soaking in pus. In fact, we can't even believe you're coming back to us now, but you can forget about it because the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. Now, one important part of my coma was that I was amnesic. And that's very unusual. In fact, I've never heard of another NDE case where it was that severe, where I had absolutely zero knowledge of Earth, humans, memories of Eben Alexander's life, our language. Any of that was all gone. It was an empty slate. And initially, as in the weeks after waking up from coma, that made some sense to me because I was still subscribing to some of my old, now disproven notions as a neuroscientist, for example, that memories were stored in the brain. So I thought, well, if I had this horrible meningitis that was wrecking my whole neocortex, I would expect those memories to be lost. Well, it turns out NDEs are much deeper proof that memories are not even stored in the brain at all. But I had to learn it kind of a tough way in going through this entire experience, having this incredible loss of memory, and then going through this rich experience when I was diving very close to death. And the good thing about that article, you mentioned the peer-reviewed article in the Journal of Nervous Mental Disease in September 2018 by Serbi Khanna, Lauren Moore, and Bruce Grayson, where they spent 2 years reviewing my medical records, far deeper dive than I ever did. And they were astonished. They were not involved in my care, but they were astonished by my recovery, which they said was really unprecedented in medical literature. But more importantly, they went through the specifics of my neurologic exams, all the medical details of my case. It made it clear that with a meningitis, it was involving all lobes of the brain, as they knew from CT and MRI scans, and then to have that amount of destruction, there was no way I was having some dream or hallucination because my brain was too damaged. And that's the part that, of course, to me had to be explained when I came back from all this.
And
At any
what's
rate,
so cool is that you've got such a perspective to understand all the inner workings of the brain from your history. If this had happened to me, there's no way I could explain it as eloquently as you do.
well, the tragedy is if I hadn't had that knowledge, if I'd been, I could have been a truck driver or plumber, electrician, whatever, and I'd had the same experience, come out of it, oh my God, wow, the world has changed. And yet my doctors then would be telling me, oh, his dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. You can forget about it. None of that is real. And I might have done that. And so it did take the knowledge of somebody who could have the experience and also look at those medical records and scans and neurologic exams and cerebrospinal fluid glucose levels and all that stuff and say, this does not make sense. This does not line up with what we know. And that was really the value of it over time. So, but briefly, to get back to your question and for your listeners to help convey the important aspects of my journey, again, none of this should have happened because of the damage I later documented to my brain that would have completely ruled out dreams, hallucinations, or this extraordinary set of visions as even being possible in that body. And that's what's so important. Now, it all started, as I said, very amnesic, no knowledge of Earth or memories of my life or anything like that, in what I call the earthworm's eye view, very primitive course on responsive realm, like being in dirty jello. It was kind of a pounding, monotonous existence. It was very foreboding the way I often describe it. And yet, given my amnesia, it didn't bother me at all. I just assumed this is existence, so accept it. And that was all there was to it. I didn't know anything better. So,
yeah, when I was reading that part, it felt like it was, when the caterpillar was in the mush. That was sort of the images that came to me.
Kind of a foreboding and murky vision, but that's why the rest of it is so absolutely astonishing. Because what emerged from that was there's the slowly spinning white light that came packaged with a perfect musical melody. And as that white light approached me, slowly spinning with these fine silvery and golden tendrils around it, it opened up like a rip in the fabric of that ugly earthworm eye view. That's what I labeled that initial phase of the journey. And it took me up into this brilliant, ultra real gateway valley. And this is where things get very strange because you cannot describe that environment with our language. Not satisfactory. Our language is good for a trip to Disney World. It's not so great for these kind of extraordinary journeys. One of the problems is in that world, in that gateway valley, I was in a world that was completely beyond and outside of Earth time. That's why when people talk about your life flashing before your eyes, a life review, which happens in probably 25 to 50% of NDE cases, and the life reviews are extraordinary. They're not just vague memories of anything. They are reliving. They're reliving from the perspective of everyone involved. People usually describe them as much more real and salient than even living events in our material bodies. So this is an extraordinary realm of kind of experience and of reckoning. And by life reviews, especially when you realize that it's from the perspective of everyone involved, you start realizing that it's an example of the golden rule. Treat others as you would like to be treated. And that very rule is written strongly in the fabric of the universe through life reviews, so that people who have handed out a lot of pain and suffering to others, in their life review, they get on the receiving end of that. And they see it didn't feel so good to be dishing that out. So life reviews are gently nudging us towards the golden rule to really take care of each other and to manifest this unconditional love. That's the deepest and most profound lesson of near-death experiences, going back thousands of years across all cultures. In fact, in one of the original NDE accounts, Plato's Republic, 2,400 years ago, this was written by Plato. And in the Republic, he talks about the Armenian soldier killed in battle. And luckily, woke up before they lit the funeral pyre. He'd been dead on the battlefield several days, but he came back to life. And his basic message was, when you die, your life flashes before your eyes. And all you realize is what mattered was how much good you brought to the world, how much love you were able to share. And the way he puts it, he kind of says that if you violate that, you pay the price tenfold, and he gives all these examples. But at any rate, he makes it very clear that the lesson that today modern science would try and tell this world about the reality of NDEs is all about how we're sharing one mind. We're all in this together. But we can get to all that as we move along here. I want to get back to my journey, and we've gotten up to the Gateway Valley. As I said, this is a timeless realm. And in fact, in Bruce Grayson, he's a skeptical MD psychiatrist at UVA who studied NDEs for more than 45 years now. And in an article he wrote in the Journal of Near-Death Studies in the fall of 2021, he made it clear that a third of people in his group had 700 life reviews, almost 698, but 700 life reviews. Wow. And a third of them said their entire life was involved. And you might say, but wait, how can that happen during a 10-minute cardiac arrest? Well, it can happen because in that realm, you're completely beyond the perceived limitations of Earth time. And that's where we can get there with meditation, the dream space, all kinds of ways that we can interact with that kind of eternal realm of mind. And NDEs are a very profound way to do that. That's very illustrative of the full potential of all this. So at any rate, in this Gateway Valley, in this timeless realm where things seem much more real than in this world, I remember I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing, and there were millions of the butterflies looping and spiraling in these vast formations. Incredible beauty, color beyond the rainbow, and below us in this verdant meadow, very fertile, surrounded by forests. There were sparkling waterfalls and crystal blue pools, and there were thousands of beings dancing in this meadow. Joy, merriment, festivities, this incredible party going on. I mean, it was absolutely lovely and filled with this kind of creative energy of bliss and joy, of being alive, of existing. And yet this was all happening in this kind of spiritual world. And I remember the best part about it was that I wasn't alone witnessing this. There was a beautiful young woman beside me on the butterfly wing, and those who've read Proof of Heaven will certainly remember this. Her sparkling blue eyes, high forehead, broad cheekbones, broad smile, soft brown hair framing her lovely face. And she never said a word to me. She never had to. Her message to me was delivered mentally, telepathically, emotionally, a mind meld. And it was a deep message that when I translated it into words and brought it back to this world weeks later, her message to me was, you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are richly cared for. And I cannot tell you how liberating and refreshing that message was. Important to point out that when all this was happening, it also started seeming extremely familiar. Like, oh, now I remember. And that's one of the things that's most rewarding about the journey, but also that was reflected in the reader's response. Thousands of people who read Proof of Heaven contacted me and said that something about their own journey had been awakened in them by the words, the language, the kind of event flow, et cetera. And it helped to awaken in them a similar memory. And that's what I think is so important to stress, is there's something I call programmed forgetting. And that is when we come into this world as higher souls, we know a lot more that is not necessarily going to contribute to the learning potential of this lifetime. And so as young children, often we might remember past life or between life memories. In fact, if you go to that UVA database, Dr. Bruce Grayson and his colleagues who have done this work in past life memories in children, you'll find that scientifically, they've studied more than 2,500 cases of children remembering past lives over the last 6.5 decades. And of those, 1,700 are solved. That is, they actually discovered the person who lived before. So it's real. It's a real part of reality. The fact that scientists claim it can't be true is only because they haven't studied the data. And the data
haven't done the work.
Anyway, getting back to my story, that's kind of the beauty of this journey, was recognizing the grand nature of soul and of soul existence. And in that gateway, that beautiful, refreshing message from that guardian angel, and then the swooping orbs of angelic choirs that were actually fueling and energizing all of the festivity and mirth that I was witnessing in this realm. I remember being just stricken by the power, the awe, the majesty of these hymns and chants, anthems, thundering through my awareness. This is pounding, awesome reality of love and of this loving force that was deeply personal. And then the next step of the journey was having all of the angelic choirs providing yet another musical portal. And I remember seeing all of four-dimensional space-time. I could kind of sense that material realm that was lying deep beneath the spiritual world, all of that collapsing down. And then the spiritual realm with a whole different ordering of causality, as I've already mentioned, about event relationships and time flow, all of that collapsing down. And as I ascended this musical portal, it led me up into what I call the core. The core was a complete resolution of all dualities. You know, in our world, we have masculine, feminine, dark, light, good, evil, all these different spectra of possibilities. And yet in the core, it all resolved down into pure oneness of bliss. And as all of that came down to its creative source, the most amazing part about it was I recognized that binding force of love and how, in fact, all of the consciousness and sentient beings originates in that God force at the core of the universe. And when you're at that deep core level, there's not some battle between good and evil. It's all absolutely pure love, kindness, compassion, mercy, the full creative flow of what's possible for our emerging reality. So in that core realm, there were many lessons. I was taught, early on, you're not here to stay. You'll be going back, but we'll teach you many things. And it turns out that I would spontaneously fall from that sanctum sanctorum of the divine, that incredible core realm, that place where I came to witness the oneness of my own conscious awareness with the God force, not as some ego thing at all, but as higher soul, as this pure energizing and enlivenment of higher soul and integrated souls working together as spirit, as the evolution of consciousness throughout the cosmos. That's essentially what's happening, is an evolutionary panentheism. And it's that God force all throughout all. But I would tumble back down to that earthworm eye view. And the good news is that I remembered the musical notes that had first been associated with that light portal. And by going through those notes in my mind, remembering the cadence of the melody, I could conjure up that light portal again, and it would lead me up into that brilliant Gateway Valley. And again, always encountering that lovely girl on the butterfly wing, the guardian angel who was so important in my journey, so reassuring and validating and affirming. And then much that I would share in that realm, but then ascending back into the core realm. And in fact, because of my amnesia, I could not have Eben Alexander life review, but I did witness life reviews and reincarnation in very powerful form in two visions. One was an early passage through the core that I call the flying fish vision, and I won't go into detail because that was nowhere near as complex and complete as a later vision, a later passage through the core, the Indra's net vision. And that one was absolutely astonishing. It was of an interwoven set of threads, and the threads represented a soul journey over multiple lifetimes. The interweaving showing our relationships is what drives the dynamism of this kind of mind discovering itself, of consciousness evolving. And the beauty of seeing all that in this kind of higher level when you can witness all of it together is so amazing. I mean, it's something that we're trapped in this kind of flow of river of time in our earthly lives, and yet we have access to far greater wisdom that transcends all of time. And that's why meditation is so key. And we can talk about that a little later, but sacredacoustics.com, binaural beat brainwave entrainment. I use meditation an hour or two a day. I've been doing that in the last 12 years. I recommend it to everybody. It's where we can explore deep into consciousness and realize that our conscious awareness and mind is not simply, resident in a 3.5-pound gelatinous mass floating in a warm, dark bath in between our ears. There's something much more going on with consciousness that's really universal. And that's what we have access to through meditation. Now, back to my journey, I would go through these levels many times. As I said, that Indra's net vision was extremely powerful as in representing the reality of reincarnation and of life reviews. Even though I couldn't have an Eben Alexander life review, I saw them in this generic form in a very powerful way. But there came a time when, just as they told me, my first passage in the core, you're not here to stay, where I tried to conjure up the musical melody out of that earthworm eye view, and it didn't work. And to say I was sad would be an understatement, but I also knew by this point that I could trust just as that beautiful woman on the butterfly wing had shared with me, and just as that God force had shared in so perfect a form in the core realm, I knew I could trust this universe, as we all can. I think that's where the importance of NDE stories and kind of getting this deeper kind of spiritual literature into oneself, especially scientifically supported spiritual literature, and realize that this is all something that can benefit each and every one of us. So for me, at that point when I could no longer conjure up the light portal to take me up into the Gateway Valley, I was then surrounded by thousands of beings going off into the distance, many with heads bowed, some holding candles up, this murmuring energy coming from them. And the surprising thing to me was that that murmuring energy had the same sense of reassurance, of validation, of love, connection, of memory of a soul journey as I'd originally encountered up in that Gateway Valley and in the core realm. And now I was feeling it with the interaction with all these beings around me. And what I called that when I came back to this world, I said that was the power of prayer, because all these beings and their murmuring energy, even though I couldn't understand the words, it was drawing me back to this world. And I didn't even know what this world was at that point. I was still in the process of learning and coming back into it. And the final thing I remember in my NDE were 6 faces that would just bubble up out of the muck. They'd say a few words, disappear. My amnesia was still active, so I didn't understand the words, and they were very mysterious, but they were important, because 5 of those 6 faces were people who were physically present in the ICU room the last 24 to 48 hours of coma. And notably, multiple other family and friends who had been there earlier in the week were nowhere in my memories. So in other words, they served as what are called veridical time anchors. These memories of these they turned out to all be close family friends, and one was one of my physicians, whose face would appear to me and then disappear. And I can remember those visions as perfectly today as if the whole thing had happened yesterday. And yet it happened, more than 16 years ago. But the fascinating thing is, when I then did start coming back to this world, I was fighting the ventilator, and they took out the breathing tube, and I said, thank you. But at that time, my brain was still too addled with this meningitis. So my mother, my sisters, my sons, I didn't even recognize who these beings were initially. I was just, still very kind of addled by the whole thing. Memories came back quickly of language, of family connections, et cetera, so that literally within a few hours, it was all coming back, very strongly. And yet that initial phase of waking up, especially because it was also the beginning of a 36-hour paranoid delusional psychotic nightmare. And so the memories of the deep coma journey that I knew, because of those 6 phases at the end, had to happen between days 1 and 4, 1 and 5, happened at a time when my neurologic exams were at their lowest level. My brain was under siege at that time. So to have all of that vision happen at a time when my brain was inactivated completely defies any kind of logical or rational sense. And so it turns out that the paranoid delusional stuff that happened after extubation, after waking up from coma, I knew was a delusion at the time. When it was happening, it seemed a little more real than a normal nightmare, but I knew it was fake, that there was too much around me and talking with my family and others that made me realize that my brain and mind were still kind of mixed up. But that's very different from what happened deep in coma. That stuff is sharp, right, crystal clear. In fact, those memories are as sharp today as if the whole thing happened yesterday. Whereas those 36-hour nightmare kind of paranoid psychosis business, those memories disappeared within weeks. So I'm glad I took the time to write as much of it down as I could remember. And I know that my older son, Eben IV, played an important role in all this. He got home 2 days after I got out of the hospital. He drove home from college. He was majoring in neuroscience at the time. And he was the one who told me, write everything down before you read anyone else's near-death experience, because he knew every time you revisit a memory, you change it. So it was important that that first take was pristine. And not only that, it was uninfluenced by anybody else's NDE. I'd never really paid any attention to that literature. So
wise words for a young man.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant advice. I'm grateful to both of my sons. They've both been extremely important at helping me to kind of process and understand the power of this journey.
Well, and especially, the role your son played on those last days. Well, that last moment, I guess.
Well, that's a very important point because the last of those six faces to appear to me was my son Bond. Now, when he appeared, I didn't recognize him. I didn't know who he was. And it turns out that was Sunday, day 7 of coma. That morning is when the doctors held a conference. They told my family I'd gone from a 10% chance of survival early in the week down to a 2% chance of survival now at day 7, on a ventilator, 7 days on 3 powerful antibiotics, but not showing signs of neurologic recovery. And that's when they were saying that it was time to let me go. And Bond had been protected from the worst news all week. But when he heard that, standing outside that room, he knew, this is much worse than they've told me. And he came running down the hallway, pulled open my eyelids that are taped shut. One eye over there, neither pupil working. And I promise you, I was not seeing him with my eyes or hearing with my ears. I was far too gone from this into that spiritual realm on this journey. But his pleading with me is what got through. Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. I didn't understand the words, but all of a sudden I sensed this incredible connection with this other soul. And this entire journey, because of my amnesia, the entire journey had been one where I thought, well, this can all continue. It can cease. Doesn't matter. Now it all mattered because there was another soul out there. And I had this deep sense of responsibility. I didn't know why, I didn't understand it, but I knew with his pleading nature, and I could sense this deep connection we shared, as father and son, even though that wasn't apparent to me, in this part of the journey. But I had to come back. And that's really what drew me back to this world. And both sons have played a tremendous role in my kind of unpacking of all this, too, my coming to a deeper understanding of it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And that reminds me, I have 2 words of the year this year were wonderful, wow. So I didn't want just wow as my word of the year because that could go wrong. But
Right.
I found myself, and I hadn't been thinking about that too much, but I found myself, I wrote in your book, wonderful, wow, at some point. I'm turning into Oprah. I'm starting to write in my books. I'm like, especially the ones I'm going to keep. And so I wrote wonderful, wow. And then a little further along in your book, I wrote it again. And then I thought maybe that's how that's showing up for me is through these amazing stories like yours that, deeply resonated with me. Then I turned the page. You were looking at the picture your sons had drawn for you, and you said, wow, wonderful. Just after I'd written it down and had
Good.
this whole
Makes
thinking
perfect
around
sense. You were
this
having a
is it.
memory of that whole set of occasions. Wow.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that was
Beautiful.
that was cool. That was one of the synchronicities that hit when reading your books.
Well, good. I'm glad you're open to these synchronicities, nudge wink from the universe that clue us into the kind of deeper sharing we have with the meaning and purpose of the universe at large.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that that has been there for a very long time. I remember, like I said, as a kid, having these Children of the Light books around me at home. I mean, I was raised early years going to church, and then my parents stopped. They both had busy jobs. My mom was a nurse, my dad aircraft engineer, but we had a farm, and so it
Uh-huh.
was a very busy time. But
Right.
and then the church aspect is, there's not a lot of room for this in some religious beliefs. And so although my mom had a lot of interest here, and especially in my years, say 6 to 12, that we talked about that stuff more. And then they got into religion in my teenage years. And then that's when these stories stopped. But one of the things that jumped out at me when I was reading Living in a Mindful Universe is the story of your friend meeting Karen and asking if she'd had an NDE. And she
Right.
said not that she'd remembered.
Right.
And then I guess it turns out I think that she's thought she's had a few now looking back. So that just sent me on this deep dive because I remember my mom telling me and showing me, I'd found this photo back in 2012 and I was just under 2 and I was snuggling with my mom beside the pool And she said, I'd found you. You were face down in the pool, no breathing, no pulse. And she scooped me up, and then I regained everything. And she said I
Wow.
didn't move. I clung to her like a little, snail
Wow.
the rest of the day. And reading Karen's or your story there with your friend and Karen, I was like, huh, maybe I did. Maybe I
Well,
did have an NDE at that time.
Well, absolutely. It's so great that you mentioned that because it's happened in a lot of people. And that particular story you're referring to was Dr. Pim van Lommel. That
Yeah,
was our friend. And he's a
yeah.
Dutch cardiologist. He's one of the sweetest, most wonderful and intelligent physicians I've ever met. And he wrote a landmark paper that changed the scientific thinking on near-death experiences back in 2001. It was in the very esteemed scientific journal Nature, Lancet, sorry, Lancet, where he covered more than 300 cardiac arrest patients in Dutch hospitals and found that roughly 1 in 5 of them had a profound near-death experience occurrences. And he's very perceptive about souls and things like that. When he met Karen, he knew she had had an NDE, and this was the first time he met her. And I think he was sensing the same thing I picked up on when I first met her. I sensed this real kind of spiritual depth, someone who had been here from the very beginning of time. And, I saw as a partner to do this work. But I think Pim sensed the very same thing when he first met Karen. And he was quite certain. And it turns out she had had some childhood seizures that potentially might have given her that same kind of doorway. But I'm so glad you are attuned to the possibility in your own life, because often, an NDE like that at age 2 can cause major changes in kind of your life and soul journey, but you might not have much memory of it.
Yeah.
So it takes, hypnotic regression or meditation or another NDE or something like that to awaken those memories. But very important you mentioned that concept, because there are a lot of people out there who have something happen to them when they're a young child, that may be potentially near fatal, and yet they recover from it. And I think a lot of those do involve near-death experiences that can provide a profound kind of spiritual catalyst to enable their further growth in their lifetime. So just
Yeah,
another reason
yeah,
to embrace the challenges and hardships. Almost dying can be a real gift.
right? Yeah, I resonated with so much of what she'd said, and I'd always had a very optimistic, rose-colored glasses view of the world. And it didn't mean that I didn't see what was going on or didn't experience my share of hardships and stuff like that. But my perspective has always been quite different. And I had thought that that was just from, growing up on a farm, spending a lot of time by myself with animals. And as you can see, my cats come to join us.
Good.
And so, do you know what's funny in that book? There was, in the proof of heaven, I zoomed through that book because it was such a juicy story, and I appreciate how you slowed it down by turning it into a story of the people outside, like what was happening in the lives of those around you, um, and added different elements in there, which slowed me down and made me pay attention and really savor your NDE experience.
Mhm.
And then I found reading a mindful universe or living in a mindful universe. I've spent my last 2 decades of my career in clean tech in a very sciencey engineering world, although I'm not a scientist or an engineer, although I've just felt like I've gotten that by osmosis. And
Mhm.
I found that that book really appealed to that analytical side of me. And I had to go slowly through that book because I kept on getting these gems that would come up, and then I'd have to further investigate.
Right.
And
Well,
so it was a completely different experience, both wonderful reading both books. And I've still got from living in a mindful universe, I still have a lot of things that I want to explore there because of what was brought up. And I can't wait to go explore those further.
Well, I'm so glad you're enjoying that. And might I mention also, for the benefit of your audience, but for your benefit too, is there is a companion workbook that goes along with the book, Living in a Mindful Universe. That workbook is free and it's available at ebenalexander.com. And it's a 33-day email drip campaign. So when you get to ebenalexander.com, all you do, there's a little banner there, your 33-day journey into the heart of consciousness. Click on that, put in your first name and an email address, and you're off and running. And more than 13 or 14,000 people have taken that course over the last few years. And they leave comments, and they also help each other in these comments. So when you're participating in that email course, you'll have access to all those comments and this whole community that's growing. So and plus it comes with 4 sacred acoustics titles to help you get into meditation. And all that's for free at ebenalexander.com. And it's a good way to really start getting into this. But I would suggest to you, since you seem to be enjoying Living in a Mindful Universe, that you might enjoy that workbook portion too.
Well,
And see how other people are interacting with this.
I've started. I'm on day 5.
Good.
And I am enjoying that very much.
Well, good. Well, I'm so glad. And to me, I love having that out there. It's helped a lot of people.
Right?
You don't have to put out a penny for it. It's right there. And plus, it's a building, evolving community with a lot of people joining and sharing their own stories. And that's where a lot of the power really comes. In fact, for me, one of the greatest gifts of sharing my story, going public, even though I knew from a scientific standpoint, potentially I was putting myself at risk because there were still a lot of materialists around, even though the scientific world in general has rejected materialism. With the awarding of the Nobel Prize in Physics for entanglement in 2022, we left behind the world where we were pretending that space-time and the general theater of materialist science was the ultimate kind of theater of operations of scientific knowledge. We now know that's not true. Entanglement is the mental field across space and time throughout the universe. And that is a rich, incredible scientific concept, but it helps us to eliminate the bleak and paltry fiction of materialism. And the danger of materialism as a thought system is that it's what's led to so much of the bad aspects of our current world. Threat of nuclear weapons, the addiction to fossil fuels, all these things have to do with a false sense of separation that's inherent in materialist thought. And there's some form of competition. It all came along in the mid-20th century, these discussions that also involved Darwinian evolution. And I love how Pierre Teilhard de Chardin in the mid-20th century was wise enough to realize, yes, there's evolution going on, but it's far richer and grander than just biological evolution on Earth. He recognized that all of consciousness was in the process of evolving. And that's, in fact, what this discussion is all about, is the one mind, how we all use it. We all interact with that one mind. But often Karen and I use the analogy, it's like a diamond. That one mind is the diamond, and each facet on the diamond is an individual sentient being having its perspective of observation and interaction and free will. And it's all those different facets with their operations of free will and independence that end up leading to self-discovery of this thing called consciousness. And we're all involved in that beautiful, grand process of awakening and awareness. But it also involves love, compassion, kindness. I often say the love of the creator for the creation, given that each and every one of us is just a projection of that God mind. As I said, in the core, it was clear to me that my very conscious awareness, as for all of us, is rooted in that God source of pure, infinitely loving, creative love and compassion, kindness, mercy. When necessary, forgiveness. But these are the deep principles that emerge from the world of NDEs and the scientific study of consciousness with near-death experiences as a tip of the spear that really educate us about this far grander role that we're all serving. But it's not the little egotistical, get all the toys you can before you die. It's much more, what can you contribute to the higher good when you acknowledge that you're an eternal soul? And that's really where the big value of all this kind of discussion, kind of thought process, it's where it leads us that is very valuable, because NDEs are important, not just that they show us that death of the body is not the end of our relationships with our soul groups, but especially in NDEs inform us how to live these lives in these bodies. That's very important. And I'm so glad I was rescued from my kind of materialist tendencies at age 54 when I had this extraordinary near-death experience that illuminated me and enlightened me about the nature of reality. And it's something I love to share.
So besides the materialistic tendencies, what has changed about your character, or what have been the main changes for you since the NDE? I know you've left neurosurgery
Right. Yeah, I
and
stopped operating actually about 4 months before the book Proof of Heaven came out. And it turns out, I realized I'd been giving talks for about 2 years on my near-death experience and its implications, and they were getting very involved, and I was getting more and more invitations to speak. And I realized you cannot do neurosurgery part-time. At least that's
yeah.
not the way I could ever practice neurosurgery, to
No,
sign off my
I
patients.
want my neurosurgeon to be living and breathing neurosurgery.
Yeah, exactly. And I recognized basically in about June of 2012 that that was no longer the best pathway forward. And so I had to let neurosurgery go. And yes, I love neurosurgery. It was a beautiful way to spend my life. There are many, many days where I still miss it, but I also realized I made the right choice. I did exactly what I was supposed to do. I was never meant to go back in the operating room, spending my days, saving one patient at a time or trying to save one patient at a time. But I had a much bigger mission. And that's something I've had no regrets about. And as I said, by sharing my story, I've had thousands of people share their own stories with me. And that has been very enriching. In fact, that was the subject matter of that second book, The Map of Heaven. Map of Heaven is not really more my personal story so much as a demonstration that these are kind of universal experiences that have happened to billions of people and souls in this world, and that we need to pay attention to them because they give us an idea of who we are in the bigger picture, in the bigger scheme of things. So the NDE, challenges to neuroscience and philosophy of mind about understanding this relationship between brain and mind is a very beautiful gift to the world because it's deep and challenging. This is why there's still so much controversy about it. And yet all the evidence leads in one direction. And that's the direction of the one mind, that our souls are eternal, that reincarnation is absolutely real, that our soul groups tend to stick together in this process of kind of helping each other grow into greater wisdom. It's all very amazingly kind of comforting and reassuring. And yet some materialists, I think, are frightened when they think that, there actually is kind of an accounting for your actions. So because the life review is a very clear case that we don't have the freedom to do anything and treat people any way we want, but we do. In a sense, we have free will, but we quickly find in life reviews that if we've mistreated people, that doesn't feel good at all. And it's not a way to behave. And that's what we find in our life review. So to me, it's an
So
incredible gift.
have you found then that are you kind of at a constant level of Zen then since your NDE, or do you go up and down?
I would say I still have fluctuations like any of us, but not only from my NDE, but I would attribute a tremendous amount of my current sense of calm and ease and comfort and satisfaction with the nature of reality in my existence with the meditation. And I mentioned a little while ago, I meditate an hour or two a day. I've been doing that for more than 12 years now. And the important thing for people to get is meditation is all about recognizing you are not your ego mind. You're not that little linguistic voice in your head. I love how Michael Singer in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls that voice in your head your annoying roommate. Yep, that's it. Enough said. That's not your consciousness. The mystery of consciousness is your self-awareness. And in fact, we're sharing the mind of the universe. And that's the brain serves as a filter, reducing valve, or a transceiver that allows us to interact with that primordial God mind of pure consciousness. And yet, as I said, each and every one of us has our own perspective. And that's what creates the dynamic that allows the growth of consciousness. But it's an incredibly important shift in understanding to realize the brain and body are not the ultimate source of your self-awareness, but that is something that you're borrowing from the universe at large. And it's something that only gets greater when you leave the brain and body. But this is something that all of us can come to know through a regular process of meditation. And I discovered 2 years post-coma, when I was looking for very aggressive ways to meditate deeply, I found the notion of binaural beat brainwave entrainment. Originally, an article in 1973 in Scientific American by Gerald Oster, auditory beats in the brain. That's what got me going, but also exposure to people who worked at the Monroe Institute in Virginia, where Robert Monroe had developed audio techniques for deep out-of-body experiences, and other people had adapted those techniques of binaural beats and used them with remote viewing, which is one of the most proven kind of fields of non-local consciousness, even though Wikipedia tells you remote viewing is pseudoscience. But sadly, that's because Wikipedia is a pseudo encyclopedia. It has pseudo editors who claim that their source is the only one that matters, and they especially on spiritual topics, Wikipedia is completely useless. You can throw it out. But the reality is remote viewing, as Jessica Utz, who is the head of the American Statistical Association, in 2015, when she gave her presidential address on talking about precognition, that is, that humans can be shown to know the future a few seconds in advance in certain computer model assessments, and also in remote viewing. Her work as a statistician had proven beyond any reasonable doubt that remote viewing and precognition were absolutely real phenomena. And yet they imply something about spirit, about mind, about consciousness that materialists recoil against and fight against. But they're fighting against the evidence. And, as Carl Sagan said, scientists should never suppress evidence because they don't know which is the right evidence to suppress. And that's what the battle has been for the last, 150 years or so. It's been reputable scientists saying, oh, near-death experiences are just nonsense. It's wishful thinking. You make it up. Well, they haven't had one, I'll tell you that. And also, I would recommend that anytime any of your listeners hears that argument coming from a scientist out there, all you got to do is go to bigelowinstitute.org. And you will find 29 essays that were written 4 years ago by scientists, all of whom had demonstrated at least 5 years' experience rigorously studying the afterlife question. And those 29 essays will convince you beyond any reasonable doubt that the afterlife and reincarnation are real. So go to bigelowinstitute.org and you'll learn a tremendous amount about the reality of this, so you can forget any little talking head materialist scientist who tries to claim that near-death experiences and other, after-death communications, things like that are nonsense because materialist science theoretical models don't allow them. Well, you can throw those people out the window because the evidence all leads towards the reality of our shared mind and of the binding force of love and how we're all truly in this together.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I have two further questions, and then I wanted to hear your final words of wisdom, and we can then wrap up because I'm mindful of the time. So you're talking about sound and meditation to help you get to those deeper states. What about some of these other brain tools that I've heard about and tried, some of them that have got the sound and the lights? Right. What do you think about that to, I guess, enhance meditation or sound is working for you? Or
well, let me tell you about that. First of all, the reason I was attracted to binaural beats back in 2011, when I first encountered the concept, was I found this article by Gerald Oster made it very clear what was going on. And the sounds, the binaural beats, you're using slightly different frequencies to the two ears. By slightly different, I mean anything between a fraction of a cycle per second, a fraction of a hertz, Hertz, up to about 20 hertz. And after that, the brain loses track, so it won't follow it anymore. It doesn't work. But in that lower frequency range, you can generate a very powerful signal that's the arithmetic difference between the input signals. So if I put in 100 cycles per second to this ear, 104 cycles per second to this ear, in the brain, you get a 4 hertz difference, a modulation, a kind of wow, 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 wow kind of feeling deep down in the brain. And that's what's doing the work. And what's happening is you're causing those two sounds. Every sound you've ever heard, chant, anthem, hymn, what have you, has been processed in the acoustic cortex of the temporal lobes. And, that might induce some kind of a spiritual journey or what have you. But way down in the circuit we're talking about now, you've gone from a circuit, for those regular sounds we hear, a circuit that evolves in the last 2 or 3 million years in Homo sapiens and in the primates. Very different are the sounds of sacred acoustics and other binaural beats, because those sounds are intersecting in the lower brainstem in a circuit that's more than 300 million years old. In fact, it originated as a localization circuit, so that even before animals had eyes, when they only had a sound sensation to warn them of threats, this circuit is an alerting mechanism. And this particular circuit can modulate everything going up in higher levels of the brain. And there's something about that modulatory effect that can be very relaxing and stimulating. And it kind of takes you out of the here, now, and sense of self. It basically, you're using it to put that little voice in your head, your ego voice, into timeout. You're using it to connect with that kind of higher soul aspect of self by this very vigorous oscillation in the lower brainstem. I mean, a similar thing is used for hypnosis, for example, pendulum, eye movements, EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, eye movements back and forth are invoking circuits down in the midbrain to cause this effect, and they're very effective. But what we're now talking about with sacred acoustics and binaural beats is going to an even more primitive, even more powerful primitive circuit in the brain. And that's why I think they work so well. Now, the problem in as I see it, we've tried some of those light mechanisms, with flashing lights, strobes, et cetera. And there's a big problem with, in my mind, as a neuroscientist with all that, is because what that does is it drives all the activity way up into the neocortex, these really recent circuits. It's not doing as much good to actually shake you free of your conscious awareness, free of the here, now, and sense of self that we can do when we go to much more primitive circuits, which you can do with sound. You often hear this story. People say, well, the doctor told me sound is the last thing to go. In other words, sound is the last thing that somebody perceives with, as opposed to vision. And that's part of the story. But, ultimately, we're talking about perceptions that don't even involve any aspect of the brain and body and its perceptual mechanisms. We're talking about wisdom and knowledge. I call it knowledge through identification that happens in these deep meditative states, and as well as in any of these other deep explorations, hypnotic regression, et cetera, or having an NDE or an after-death communication, or having a shared death experience, which are just like near death, that happen in perfectly healthy people. Shared death experiences are extraordinary, and they were first described by Raymond Moody, who wrote that 1975 book about NDEs called Life After Life. Well, he and Paul Perry wrote a book, and I think it was in 2011, Glimpses of Eternity, which is all about shared death experiences. And I'd heard a lot of shared death cases from my audience, wasn't sure what to label them. But shared death happens in either healthcare workers, but more commonly a loved one. The loved one can be at a great distance. They can be 10,000 miles away. It doesn't matter. In the spiritual realm, there's no limitation of distance. So at any rate, but shared death, that's just another example of the kind of experience that is studied. So when you put all of these together, as we do in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, you start making the case of the one mind, and the brain is a transceiver. And in that book, we also list not only all the scientific arguments and kind of overlap of science and spirituality, but we have a lot of tips in there about meditation and about binaural beats and how they can be used to enhance meditation. And that's why that workbook that I suggested to you, 33-day journey into consciousness, it's there at ebenalexander.com, can be so valuable to people, because it helps them get on board and gives them 4 sacred acoustics audio files to work with to start getting into deep meditation.
Yeah, and maybe that's the answer to this question, this final question, before I ask you your final words of wisdom, is what would your advice today be for, you've got someone who's come in to have a consult with you as a neurosurgeon, pretend that you are you today, and they've been given a rather tough diagnosis. And so they're sitting there, they've received this rather tough diagnosis. What would you say to them now that would be different than what you would have said to them before your NDE?
Well, that's a beautiful question. And I've answered that question in some of our writing adventures, et cetera. But the reality is it would be very reassuring. I mean, there is no doubt in my mind of the reality of afterlife experiences and of reincarnation. And as a society, we are waking up to the great wisdom that comes from this deeper acknowledgement of the empirical evidence that supports our continuation as souls, and also, more importantly, our connection as souls. And I would also be pointing out how critical the whole process, the dying process, is an extremely powerful catalyst for everybody involved, for the entire family involved, for the patient who's going through it, for the souls on the other side. I mean, every bit of this helps to strengthen and basically energize this beautiful story of our eternity of souls and our interconnections, and how we're all here to help each other, and that it's all about love and kindness and compassion, and that ultimately there are some beautiful kind of utopian futures available to us as a human species, but we need to get rid of our false sense of kind of ego existence and materialist kind of competition of with other souls, competition in a world, in a zero-sum world, and realize, no, that the way to live the most satisfying and progressive souls in terms of a soul journey and coming into the reasons we came into existence in the first place is to acknowledge this grander role of self and of soul, and how we're all in this to take care of each other and help each other. And the more we can acknowledge that, realize that's a fundamental lesson that's been given by NDEs and related experiences, it makes all of our lives much easier. It removes the stress. It's amazing what damage that fear of death does to this world at large. But also, it's important to learn we take life very seriously. It's always a violation of basic tenets to commit homicide or suicide. And so we need to grow and move beyond all of that. And start using these lessons for growth in a very positive way. And that's what I think is coming from, the scientific community, certainly more fully accepting the reality of these journeys and what they're telling us about the nature of our existence and who we are.
Yeah, and I guess like your evidence of miracles do happen.
Miracles do happen. And that's a very important thing to stress. Watch out for your beliefs. They're more powerful than you may think. I know Larry Dossey, a good friend of mine, he's an MD, brilliant writer on all these topics, but he wrote one book, be careful what you pray for, because prayer has a lot more power than some people acknowledge. And also your beliefs can also lead into darkness. If you don't believe this brighter vision, it's not necessarily going to be so available to you. You need more time in the darkness to find it. But
Right.
when you believe in this brightness and when you start seeing it and knowing it's real in your life, and you start meditating and bringing that brilliance of light, love, wholeness, and healing into your own being every day through meditation, and sharing that in the way you interact with your fellow beings, it has a way of brightening your world very powerfully. So be careful of your beliefs, because falsely limiting beliefs can falsely limit you. Whereas wide open beliefs that are optimistic and harmonious and really seek the highest possibilities for human interaction and development and evolution, those tend to have a way of happening. Currently, we have a lot of polarization and fear and anxiety in our world, but that's where our beliefs are critical. And meditation, the more of us who are meditating, the more this world will drift beautifully into the right direction.
And well, this episode has been packed with wisdom, but are there any final words of wisdom you'd like to leave us with before we wrap up?
I think the most important thing is for people to realize how important beliefs are, and to start adventuring by seeing themselves as this higher soul over multiple lifetimes that's here to bring good to the world, to make other people much more kind of comforted with their living and harmonious sense of coexistence. That the more we focus on those kinds of very positive interrelationships, the more it can lead to a very positive development in this world at large. And I think if you'll experiment with your power of belief and meditation, you will rapidly find that you are a far more willful being than materialist scientists would grant you. In fact, many materialist scientists would scoff at you for even claiming to have free will. So for you to have a will that leads this world in the right direction and focuses on the higher good and on sharing love and compassion with your fellow beings and recognizing this is not just about humans, but how we treat animals, how we coexist, because they are also richly spiritual beings. In many ways, a richer spiritual being than a human that has a linguistic center that can talk it out of some of the greatest spiritual observations it might make. That's what this whole kind of revolution and discussion is all about. But I welcome you to the revolution. The world is changing rapidly, and it's changing in a way that it can be very friendly and accommodating to loving, compassionate souls.
Well, that's a terrific way for us to wrap up. Thank you so much for your time on the Miles to Zen podcast. I'm sure your listeners have, or our listeners have enjoyed that just as much as I have.
Well, thank you, Shannon. It's been a beautiful speaking with you today, and I love what you're doing. Thanks for getting this out to the world, and I'm so glad that we did get together. Thanks for the invitation, and we'll talk again soon.
If you have listened to this whole podcast, I'm sure you will like these extra moments from our conversation. Yesterday, I did this somatic session, and I imagined this really great space that I was going back up into the Himalayas. I was doing what you've said that you do in your book about breathing into this heart space before you start.
Right.
And so I was doing that, and then I had this image of you and I climbing up to this little hut in the middle of the Annapurna circuit in the Himalayas.
Oh, boy.
And we were settling in for a delicious conversation in this small little hut with a milk tea, maybe a Mars bar. It's at 18,000 feet, 5,400 meters. And that was the vibe I felt entering into this conversation, and it just came out of the blue.
Well, good. Well, thanks for sharing that vibe. I have been up in the Himalayas, but I've not been that high in the Himalayas. I was in places north of Kathmandu that were about 12,000 feet up, but I never got a lot higher than that. But that's great. Well, that's what I'll picture we're doing our little conversation.
Then I was thinking that we could, of course, talk about your NDE and then dive into your two books, the ones that I've really looked into, and of course, anything else that stirs your soul.
Now, I'm assuming that by two, you mean Proof of Heaven and Map of Heaven. Is that, because you mentioned how you had found, oh, good. Yeah. So Proof of Heaven and Living in My Own, that's excellent. Those are the two I would have picked. They're the two by far most relevant books to this story. So
I'm going through this, and about halfway through, I start getting more stories from Karen. And I was just like, this is good. I appreciate all of you who've listened to this all the way to the end. Clearly, Dr. Alexander's story has resonated with you as much as it did with me. What are your thoughts? Please share in the comments. I am so grateful to this beautiful community we are creating here at Miles to Zen. And just like this conversation, it completely fills my bucket. Have a wonderful week. See you next week.